Hi everybody, welcome. Thanks for choosing to attend this talk. Today we're going to have a kind of an easy talk on your first .NET on RHEL application. We should have a lot of good tips. If you liked what you saw this morning, we'll dig a little bit deeper into that. We'll try and make it real easy to learn, and by the time you leave this, hopefully you'll be excited about the idea and ready to get out there and develop that first application. The title of the talk is A Quick Guide to .NET Development on Red Hat Enterprise Linux. This session will be introductory level, so not too deep. If you've never written any .NET C# in your life, you should come out of here with enough to write some pretty basic applications and know how to write more than basic ones. It's going to include an architectural overview, some code samples, some code practices, how to get started, a little bit about developer life, and this talk is going to be appropriate for technical viewers of all abilities. Before we start, please humor me. I want to take a little survey. If you are less than 20 years old, if you're 20 years old or younger, would you please raise your hand? Do we have any young programmers here, young developers? Okay, if we have anybody in their 20s, please raise your hand. Do we have any 20-year-olds? Handful, thank you very much, put them down. If you're in your 30s, please raise your hand. Ah, the majority, thank you very much. If you're in your 40s, please raise your hand. Very good, thank you, thank you. If you're in your 50s, raise your hand, please. Good, thank you. If you're 60 or older, please raise your hand. Okay, it looks like we pretty much mirror what I've been noticing, and maybe you guys have too, in surveys on D-Zone and other places. It looks like what's happening within our career path is we have a good pipeline through the 20s. Through the 30s, we have a really healthy number of programmers. By the time we get to 40, something goes on, and we lose some of our ranks. And by the time we get past 40 to the 50s and 60s, we're just about decimated. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go on, just for something interesting. About me, my name is Rick Wagner. Please call me Rick. I've been a programmer for 26 years. I'm a Sun-certified enterprise architect and Java programmer. I've worked in banking, call center software development, credit fraud detection, which is an interesting story. I worked in that arena for Visa and MasterCard. Those businesses fight like cats and dogs. They hate each other. They battle like crazy, but in one area they collaborate, and that one area is fraud detection. They wrote some really neat applications to deal with that. It was fun work. I've worked in demographics and big data, and now I work for Red Hat for the past 6 years as a support professional. It's a really interesting career and a good line of work. My IBM Systems reference card is yellow, and I'll tell you a little bit about what I mean by that. This card has two purposes. The first one was entirely practical. Back in the day when COBOL was the only environment for developers like us to be in, you would get issued one of these in probably your first or second year of programming. And what it was for is it contains the operations codes, the assembly language code, for your particular flavor of mainframe. And the pointers explains where the pointers are and how long the data is for each instruction. When your program was running, if you happen to be unfortunate enough to have it crash in the night, the operator, the original part of DevOps, the operator part, would call you up. You would get up in the middle of the night, answer the phone. He'd say, come in, and you'd say, please print the dump. And what that meant was he would print on green bar paper, that paper about like this, a stack this high of the memory of that mainframe. And you would drive in a groggy state, and you would take this thing and a pencil or a pen, and you would circle it and find out what instruction was operating and what the data was, and then you'd figure out why your computer choked. It's probably because you were trying to do math on alphanumeric data, and you'd figure out how you're going to change that record. You'd run the program again, but you'd fix that record that was broken. Hopefully it would go through that time and it'd be fixed. That was why this was invaluable. But the second use of this card is why I'm telling you about it today. Mine is yellow, which means it was printed in the late 80s or early 90s. IBM would change this book once in a while, and when they did, they would change the color of the cover. I worked with some folks in the shop where I first started programming. A guy about 15 years older than I was had one with a green cover. And there were a couple of early programmers there too, that these guys were just about retirement age when I was starting. Their books were white or pink. And these folks were my mentors. They shared with me ideas that helped shape my career and help me along. And that's why it's important, I think, that we keep this in mind and why I'm concerned about this drop-off in programmers' age that I'm going to talk a little bit about before. If we end up this talk with enough time for a few minutes to spare, I'll share with you some words of wisdom that my mentors gave me that I hope can help you all too. It's something that we should pass along, and I hope it maybe encourages you all to share with others too. Okay, I'm a principal support engineer for Red Hat, which means I work for you. If you go home after this talk or after this show and you start working with .NET on RHEL and you open a support ticket up, there's a good chance I'll get that ticket. If you work with Camel on EAP, or if you work with Switchyard, or if you work with the CDK, I may be the person that answers those questions. So thank you for subscribing to Red Hat. I appreciate it. You're my boss, and I've left some mental cues up here. These pictures, my name, Richard Wagner, the famous opera composer. If you open a ticket and you notice the name of the support guy is an operatic composer, it's probably me. Say hi, we'll have a good conversation. Okay, your first .NET Core application on RHEL. I chose this picture to depict this talk because we've got a machine here that's kind of two parts. One part is very basic, very efficient, not too many moving parts. The other part is a little bit snazzier, some newer pieces, and some things that maybe aren't so easy to see what they're up to. It's a hybrid, and that's what .NET on RHEL, of course, is. What we're going to talk about today is the why, what, how, and where. Why is your motivation for caring. I'm going to tell you why you ought to care about writing .NET on RHEL. What, we're going to talk about what the big pieces are so that you know what you're getting when you get your .NET on RHEL installation. How is your first steps on writing .NET applications? And this is going to be very easy. It's going to be just so simple you won't believe it, but we'll also give you a trail to get to where you can write better applications than the very simplest ones. And where is going to talk about where you go from here, how you keep getting better. Why? Why should you care? .NET Core, and we'll talk in a little bit about the difference between .NET and .NET Core, there's a big difference, is a growing language. Microsoft is very good at making languages popular. They're a developer machine. They make languages that scads and scads of people use. So I think if you invest some time in learning .NET Core, it'll probably be time well spent. I may be wrong, but I don't think so. Microsoft is investing in a big way here. Microsoft also has some awesome learning resources. As developers, we all love to learn, and Microsoft gives us things like MSDN, Channel 9, which as Red Hat people, this is a Red Hat conference, you may not know what Channel 9 is. Channel 9 is their video outlet, and they have all kinds of great videos on how to use their products. So as you're learning things, there's a good place to learn things about it. And for me, one of the greatest things about .NET Core is it's even newer than you think. In our workspace as developers, Enterprise Java has been the big dog for quite a while, along with .NET, the traditional .NET, not .NET Core, the traditional .NET. Now, lately, if you guys haven't noticed, Enterprise Java and .NET, the regular flavor, have been like watching the end of a Rocky movie or something. They're these two monoliths that have been battling for about 15 rounds, and they're tired and they're running out of gas. They both are. Enterprise Java is kind of looking for where it's supposed to go, and .NET has run out of spaces because it runs just on Windows, and everyone today likes to use Linux, OS X, and mobile devices. So both of these have been very good for a number of years, but they're getting a little wheezy. And the newest contender, it seems like, to try and take this share has been Node.js, right? Node.js is a serious contender these days. As you learn .NET Core, this new variation of .NET we're going to talk about, you will also be learning a lot of things about Node.js, interestingly enough. All those tools like grunt, gulp, JavaScript, uglifying, minifying, those will all become available to you, not forced on you. You don't have to use them, but as you look at some of the examples that are provided to you, you'll start to assimilate this knowledge. So it's a good investment in time, I think. Okay, as a manager, we just talked about why you should care as a developer. If you happen to be a manager, there are good reasons to want to run .NET on RHEL also. RHEL is great in the data center. We're stable, efficient, trusted, great in the cloud, including on Microsoft's Azure. RHEL is just a great place to run your applications. Now, the other side to that, we have a Reese's peanut butter cup right here. You got peanut butter on my chocolate, I got chocolate on your peanut butter, if you all remember the old commercial. The Microsoft advantage to this thing is that Microsoft has a zillion developers. I don't know if you realize that or not, but if you look at developer counts, Microsoft owns tons more than other languages and frameworks do. and they're easy to staff development projects, and .NET developers can work in the RHEL environment for the first time with .NET Core on RHEL. Still more reasons why, in the long run, easy always wins. You know what? We're developers. We have to invest a lot of mind share and time in learning something. The easy but competent framework almost always wins out. And Microsoft is the king of making things easy. I'm sure they're going to do it here too. And we'll see in a little bit how easy it is to already write things with this new .NET Core, which is in its infancy. It's going to grow from here. If you doubt this point, if you think easy doesn't win, talk to some folks that used to be C or C++ programmers. Because back in the client-server era, about the year 2000 or so, they owned the landscape. That was the dominant language and framework then. Java came along and ate its lunch. And the reason Java won was because it was much easier. Easy, easy always wins. Summarize the why of this talk. The greatest runtime environment, which is RHEL, works best when it has a full complement of development tools, including .NET Core, this new .NET. Okay, what? Let's talk about the pieces that are .NET Core. The big pieces are .NET Core itself, the SDK, tooling, NuGet, and some development frameworks. And I'm going to give you a thumb-sized view of all of these right now so you know what you're talking about when you look at some documentation or you make your downloads. .NET Core, excuse me, is the language and libraries needed to run applications. What is .NET Core? It's not .NET. .NET is the old version. The up to 4.6 was what Windows developers used to write with. And .NET used to battle it out with Java, right? There was a fork there. As a developer, you were either a Java developer or a .NET developer, generally in the middleware space. That was the old .NET. The new one, a couple years back, Microsoft realized they're running out of growth space because the old .NET ran only on Windows. That's all it was. They couldn't run on Linux. They couldn't run on Mac. So they decided to change things, and now the new .NET Core is the version that runs on any platform. It's like Java. You write it once, you run it wherever you want. That's what .NET Core is, and that's what runs on RHEL. The same application will run on Windows or Mac OS if you want it to. This runtime is not all you need to build applications, though. You need tools to do the actual building. So this is kind of analogous to the Java JRE, the Java runtime environment. The .NET Core language framework is something like that. The SDK is what you get, kind of like the Java JDK, a superset of those libraries needed to run, what you need to develop things. So it's core plus what's called tooling. When you're reading the doc and you see tooling, what we mean is the things you need to compile programs, like the Java JDK, JAVAC, and Java. This is what's provided with RHEL. When you get .NET Core on RHEL, that's what you get, both pieces. You get what you need to write the application, you get what you need to run the application. Tooling are those pieces that you use to write your application. Now, this is the first time we'll see these three things. You probably saw them this morning in the keynote when they said .NET New, .NET Restore, .NET Run. That's all you need to write your first application for .NET on RHEL. Those three things, .NET New, .NET Restore, .NET Run. I remember when I wrote my first Java program, if you use packages, what you had to do is you had to make a little directory structure hierarchy. You had to edit your main program, whatever you called it, your main class. You had to remember all the right syntax and case sensitivity and stuff like that. You had to remember what kind of argument main took. You had to compile it from the right directory, and you had to run it from the right directory, which is a little heavy for something you're just learning. With .NET, it's just .NET New, .NET Restore, .NET Run, and you're off to the races. Tooling is Microsoft's build and run utilities, and you can think of it as part of the SDK. NuGet. If we have Java developers in the audience, you all recognize what Maven does, right? When you use Maven, you configure it in your config file to say, here are the dependencies I have. These are the libraries I need for my application and how I need them. This is analogous to .NET Core's NuGet utility, okay, or Node.js's NPM utility. It's how you fulfill your dependencies. They come from somewhere, probably the internet when you're first getting off the ground. Later on, when you've got your own corporate structure in place, it'll probably be your own repository, but it's the way that you get those libraries that you need. You control NuGet where it gets the libraries with a config file. or actually a hierarchy of config files. It's pretty easy to use. It's automatic if you just want the defaults, but NuGet is how that's done. It comes into play when we do our 3 steps to the first application, .NET New, .NET Restore, .NET Run. .NET Restore is what says, okay, NuGet, go out, bring down the right versions of the right libraries that I need for my application. Other frameworks. Once you get started with .NET Core, you'll probably write a Hello World application, or you'll have one written for you by those 3 steps we talked about already. And then you'll want to do something a little more exciting, like do some web work, or work with some databases or things like that. Here's a couple of frameworks you'll need to know about. ASP.NET Core, ASP.NET Core, excuse me, is the web application build environment. That's what you use to build your web applications. It's like Java and Java's servlets, JSPs, and JSFs. REST applications are written in .NET or ASP.NET Core also. These are called web APIs. So when you're reading the Microsoft doc or watching a video on Channel 9, when they say web API, you can think REST if you're a Java person. The entity framework is like Hibernate to Java people. The entity framework is how you take your data classes and marshal them back and forth to a database without having to write code by yourself. Very easy to use, and just like Hibernate, it's the equivalent there for .NET. How? Here's the getting started section. This is really, really easy. Okay, we've made it very simple to get going. Your 3 steps are just get the software, check out the examples, and then build your own. How do you get the software? These 2 steps, sudo yum install rh.net core 1, we'll get it. Sudo, if you're not a Linux user much, sudo lets you act as an administrator. Yum install is saying, go get some software for me. So you just say, install it, it should install. Then you say scl enable Red Hat.NET Core 1.0 bash. This is saying software collection enable. What software collections are is RHEL's mechanism for letting you work with really new frameworks that are likely to change a lot. RHEL is all about stability and safety and security. We want to maintain that, but we also want to give you the tools you need to work with things like Python and Ruby and Node that are pretty fast moving. So how do we do that? We came up with the idea of software collections. It's worked out pretty well to enable you to get newer frameworks if you want, but still maintain the stability of RHEL. Now, when you have software collections, you have to say which one you want to work with, because you might have Node 2, Node 3, Node 4. How do you know which one you want to work with? You do that by specifying through scl enable. So you say scl enable the version you want, in this case, .NET Core 1.0. These 2 commands are documented in our documentation and pointed to from the Microsoft documentation, so you can easily install .NET Core on RHEL. That's all there is to it. If you're not an administrator on your machine, you might have to do some things like register your machine with Red Hat and maybe install software collections. No big deal. That's about a small handful of other commands, and they're also in the documentation. And by the way, if you don't have a version of RHEL to work with, if you sign up today at redhat.developers.com or developers.redhat.com, you can get a free version of RHEL for your development use. So RHEL is available to you if you don't have your own personal version yet. You can get it free, no charge, no strings attached. Okay, your first steps. Once you've done those 2 commands to install .NET Core on RHEL, to write your first application, we already know it's .NET New, .NET Restore, .NET Run. That's all there is to it. If you do that, if you type these things on the command line, .NET New, .NET Restore, .NET Run, you get a very basic Hello World program. And contrasting that to the Java scenario, where you have to write things, put them in the right directory, and so on and so forth, this is much easier. Once you're done with the Hello World example, that will keep you happy for about 2 minutes as you look at it. It's so simple and so basic that you'll soon want to see something more. So where you'll probably want to go next is out on GitHub. .NET Core is open source. Microsoft is taking this open source stuff very seriously. Everything that's on GitHub, including the examples, so you can go out to ASP.NET and download the whole source tree if you want, or just the samples if you'd like. And there are 3 very basic samples there that show very well things that are a step above that basic Hello World you get with .NET New. So you can start with that easy one that everyone does. You'll be up and running in no time. Then after that, you can go a little bit more advanced with these 3 samples: Console App, HelloMVC, and Hello Web. Console app is a bare bones hello world. Here's the source code from console app. We see it looks a lot like Java. It's very simple. It just has one console write line, which is going to sys out. That's all there is to it. There's no firewall or port to get tangled up. This is almost certainly going to run for you. The .NET New example or this example. There's almost nothing that can seemingly go wrong. Hello Web example is a little bit more advanced. It's not doing console output anymore. It's letting you write a web application that you access with your web browser. It serves static files, and if it fails, probably suspect your firewall or the port. Some kind of issue like that is going to be what's troubling your application. It probably won't be troubled, but if it is, look to that because it's a very simple application also. HelloMVC shows the MVC framework for web apps, and we'll talk more in a minute about Microsoft and their MVC framework. It makes writing really nice web applications very easy. If you're like me, my first introduction to MVC was through struts and Java. And to be honest, it took me quite a while to figure out which way was up. It wasn't real obvious which pieces were doing what with struts. With Microsoft, King of Easy, they make everything very visible, very easy to use. You'll really like it. And I'll give you a few pointers in this talk that will help you recognize what you're looking at when you look at this simple example. If you want to write a REST application instead of a web application, Microsoft calls those web APIs, and this example will help you too. Very, very similar. Very similar to MVC is web API. And once you're done with those three, so you start with the simple one with .NET New, that's Hello World, just absolutely as simple as can be. Then come the three examples from ASP.NET, which show you some web interactions. They're also pretty sparse, so they'll probably keep you happy for a little while longer. But when you're ready for something that's almost a real application to look at, the music store that we talked about in this morning's keynote is also available. So you can go out from the ASP.NET GitHub site again, download the music store and work with it. And what it shows us is a commerce web application, kind of like Java Pet Store, if you all remember that one. MVC, including an almost real application of MVC, entity framework for working with your databases. It's a little more full-featured, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later. There will be more talks in this show about Music Store. So this is where you really dig into the meat of things. You'll be a pretty competent programmer by the time you understand Music Store. And the other applications before it lead up to this. Let's talk about what you'll look at when you see a .NET Core application. So the major parts are what's shown in the diagram on the bottom. We have two directories, bin and obj. We have a NuGet.config, optional. We have program.cs, your source code. We have project.json, and as you're compiling, you'll have a project.json.lock. The bin and obj directories are handled by the tooling. So when you go through your steps, when you say .NET restore, that runs NuGet and brings all your package dependencies. That's when these directories come into play. Until then, you don't see them. The infrastructure will make them for you. You never have to bother with them. They're just necessary to hold your artifacts. When you say .NET run, and there are other ways to do this, by the way, but the simplest way is .NET run. That's when your application becomes compiled to IL code and is actually ready to execute. You'll use these directories too. But as a developer or programmer, you don't have to worry about them. The tooling does all that. NuGet.config is your most local implementation of the configuration for NuGet, that package manager. NuGet uses a series of directories to decide where to go out and get the dependencies that you specify for it, and this is the one closest to the project. The program source is program.cs. CS is the suffix for C# source. Project.json is where you have your versions, your dependencies, and your target framework. You'll do a little bit of work in this as a developer with .NET Core. We'll look in a little bit at a sample. And the project.lock.json appears after you do the .NET restore. In the process of doing that dependency resolution, the tooling makes this for you, but you don't have to maintain it at all. It just has to be there. Okay, here's the C# source example. Again, it looks a lot like Java. The case changes a little bit, so it might be a little bit confusing for Java programmers for just a minute or two, but that's it. The program should be .cs. Here is our project.json example. So it includes things like the version of your project, the dependencies you want, and that's where you're going to do some maintenance, okay? as you add to your Microsoft .NET Core applications, you're going to want to bring in more libraries that add functionality. You'll want to edit this file to add new things that you want to use, and you'll get a handle for those from looking at those sample applications and just from a little bit of experience as you get working. The targets, the bottom one that says frameworks, tell which framework you want this thing to run on. And you'll notice on this one it says DNX 451 and DNX Core 5.0. That's interesting for a couple of reasons. Before we had .NET as our command prompt command that we use to run things like .NET New, they use things like DNX and DNU. So this is a little bit of cruft from the development of .NET Core. DNX 451 refers to the old .NET, the Windows-only .NET. So you can compile applications with .NET Core that will run on your Windows boxes with the old .NET framework on it. It'll run that. DNX Core 5.0 was what we called .NET Core 1.0 before we reversioned it. Before it was rev to 1.0, it was 5.0. So what we're showing here is you can target different frameworks for your application, and they'll compile and be runnable on each. Here's our NuGet.config file. So as we see, we can specify pretty cleanly the keys that we want, where we want to go get things from, where we want our NuGet to go to bring down the libraries that we specify. There's going to be security considerations here. After you get off the ground with your development work, you're going to care about where things come from. You don't want to just download things from the internet, so you'll probably work with a corporate repository in time. As you're just getting off the ground, playing with it, of course, the internet probably is adequate. There's a hierarchy that goes back up the directory tree all the way to your user root to put all the pieces together. So if you're confused about why you're able to get libraries and you don't know where they're coming from, look at directories in between your project directory and your user root, and maybe you'll find a NuGet.config somewhere along the way there. What NuGet does is manages packages, and it manages lots of packages. If you've used NPM or Maven, you recognize this. The first time you write a Java program with Maven, even if it's a very simple one, it seems like it downloads the whole internet. Things scroll and scroll and scroll as it downloads things, because it gets all your dependencies plus all their dependencies, the transitive dependencies. Same thing with NuGet. It works just like those other tools do. So it's going to bring down a whole lot of things that go into your home directory under a .NuGet, as we see at the bottom of the slide, home ric NuGet packages directory. So in your home, there's going to be a .NuGet directory, a hidden one, that has all these things that it gets for your application to run. That's not the worst of it. Besides that big list we just looked at, those are directories, not files. Inside each of those directories, it maintains different versions. So you're probably getting even more than you thought you got with different versions. And inside each of the version-specific directories, the middle of this screen, we have the low-level artifacts. So there's quite a few artifacts for each of those versions, and there's more than one version usually in each of the directories for the components. You're going to need some disk space to use this. But it all works automatically. As a developer, it's easy to use and friendly. Okay, let's talk about the music store. Music store includes more things that you'll typically need in a real application. So remember, if we do a .NET New, we get that hello world. We'll be bored with that in no time. Then we go off to ASP.NET GitHub, and from ASP.NET GitHub, we get 3 examples, a hello world again, plus a web application, plus an MVC. That will give you a little bit more to chew on. Then when you're ready to really start learning, you go to the music store, and let's look at some of the things we find in the music store. The top level is a little more populated, and honestly, some of this stuff we're looking at is cruft, because this application's been around for a little while. Some of it really doesn't apply anymore, and that's something else about .NET Core. Microsoft is investing in this in a big way. It's got a very active community, so things are getting better all the time. When you're looking at things, you're probably going to be sometimes looking at a little bit of cruft. The key to that is downloading artifacts using the GitHub tag, the tag for Git, that matches your release of the software. So when you get .NET Core version 1 for RHEL, get the examples with the tag 1.0. Okay, in the test directory of the music store, we'll see XUnit tests. XUnit, like NUnit for .NET or JUnit for Java, is a unit test framework. And tests are a really good way to learn about code. So if nothing else, you can take a look at this thing and see how they were unit testing some of the classes in this more full-featured application. Good way to get to be a better programmer, a little more knowledgeable programmer, study unit tests. In the shared directory, we have some interesting things. Here we have mock classes for social media connectors, like Twitter, like Facebook, things like that. So it's kind of fun to play with these things. Here are some examples on how you might go about using these kind of components in your .NET applications. Now, if you're like me, when you hear about things like that, you probably think, wow, that sounds really cool, I'd like to do that. Your second thought is probably, wow, I hope I don't check my credentials into GitHub accidentally one day, because I don't want the world to see them. You should know Microsoft has a scheme to hide those secrets. That's outside the scope about what we'll talk about today, but there's a way that you can hide your user secrets so you can check in your source code and not worry about compromising those things. The source directory has the expected amount of source for a more realistic application. There's a lot more. Looking at this thing, notice we have models, views, and controllers. And this is part of what Microsoft does. When they make things dirt easy, so lots of developers can get on board and lots of people understand it, they make it very plain to see. Node.js did this too, by the way. Your models go into a folder called models. Your views in a directory called views, your controllers in a directory called controllers. Very easy to understand where to put your things and where to look when you're looking at someone else's code. Let's have some tips on .NET Core development. So we've gone through the basics. We know how to write a hello world. We know how to get some little more advanced examples, those 3 from ASP.NET Core on GitHub. We know where to find an almost real application with the music store. I'll give you some pointers now so that when you're looking at the code for these things, you'll know what you're looking at. If you learn to recognize these, everything's going to be much easier. Okay, so the first tip, the most important one, when you go to get your examples, use the git tags to get the version that matches your version of the framework. If you get 1.0, which is what you'll get with RHEL, make sure you get the examples with the tag 1.0. That'll make everything easier. If you get the latest, by now it's probably gone past 1.0 and things might not work. It'll be confusing. So get the right version of the examples to match the framework that you're working with. Microsoft makes development easy by using strong patterns and conventions. So this is some of the stuff you can get from those Channel 9 videos. For me, that's easier than reading documentation, but they both work. I'll try and quickly enumerate them so you'll know what you're looking at when you scan the source code. If you learn to see these things and know what you're looking at, it'll be much easier to develop applications. Microsoft likes to provide sensible defaults, and they can be overridden, okay? So we'll look at some code in a little bit that says, hey, if I'm in development, act this way. If I'm in production, act another way. How does the program know? The program knows through an environment variable. You can specify that in code if you want, or you can specify it with operating system environment variables. So you can say, there's a string you use to say, here's my environment, I'm development, or here's my environment, I'm production, and your program will act appropriately if you have that kind of switch in your code. ASP.NET behaves like Node.js in some ways. If you've tried Node.js, the thought behind it is we want to provide nothing unless you specify it. They let you ask for all kinds of basic functionalities, like a bad URL error page, that's not there by default. Logging is not there by default. Error pages aren't there by default. You have to ask for all of those, but they make it easy to ask, and they make it very productive when you do ask. When you do ask, you'll see we use the builder pattern, and we use certain naming conventions in the builder pattern. So we'll have a look at how that works. And we call this middleware. So if you're dealing with .NET Core or Node.js, and someone says, oh, that's middleware, what they're talking about is little libraries that you add using the builder pattern usually to make your application more full-featured. Here's an example. This is right out of the music store. So this method is called configure development, which means I'm configuring how the application should act if I'm in the development environment. If you're running in production, this code shouldn't run. This won't be what you're looking at, the results of this, when you're in production. When you're in development, this will be what you use. We see from the lines from the middle down, we say app.use status code pages, app.use developer exception page. That's the pattern they use, app.use, there's that builder pattern. And what we're saying is, give me some status pages to gracefully handle bad URLs. And use developer exception page means if I have some problem, show me the details of what went wrong. Show me a stack trace. You wouldn't want that in production, because in production, if that happens, someone on the outside is going to see that, and that's going to be giving away some details about your application you probably don't want just anyone to know. But if you're developing, you want to know that information. So here's a technique for doing it. You do it in your configure development method, and you say app.use, there's the pattern. So when you're looking at the code, when you see a startup class and you see something like this, you should recognize immediately what's going on. And before too long, hopefully, you'll pick up some new things that you can app.use to do that. By the way, the configure name of the method is also a convention. So if you don't specify things by environment, there's probably going to be in your startup class, the startup class is usually called startup.cs by convention, and it has a configure method. And the configure method is where you tell what you want your application to do. Here's where you add all that stuff that's not there by default. So hopefully you'll recognize that. Here's some more app.uses. We say app.use session. We want to track things through session. App.use static files, same things. Here's this configure method, another place in one of the sample applications. So hopefully this is starting to look familiar. When you see it yourself, you'll know what you're looking at. One important thing, like with Node.js, in .NET Core, the order matters. So you say which of these is most important first. If it doesn't meet that condition, or if this middleware doesn't process it, it should go on to the next middleware, and it'll try and process the thing, and it'll go on to the next one. Any one of these could break the chain, kind of like chain of command design pattern for those that study design patterns. Order matters, but it's an easy way to add lots of good functionality to your application and to know exactly what it is that you're adding. Okay, here's some tips on MVC. That other stuff was just about ASP.NET. In particular, if you write an MVC application, here are some things that you'll see. There are strong patterns and defaults, class names, action methods, and so on. Controllers are the first class that acts. When your user types in a URL, the first thing that happens when they hit go, the transmission, the message goes to the framework, and a controller method catches it. Okay, a controller. You're going to have more than one controller for your application, model view controller. I think it should have been called controller model view instead of model view controller, because the controller is the first piece that gets invoked. The controller uses a naming standard, okay? In your controllers directory, in those directories, there's going to be a home folder probably, and if let's say we're dealing with an application that deals with books, there might be a books directory. Inside the books directory will be controllers that deal with books. And inside your controllers, there will be different methods called action methods. And those action methods, in this example, there's one called address and payment. That's the code that gets invoked. Each controller can have more than one action method. And what's going to be to determine which of those methods gets called, the URL will have the name of the controller and then the name of the action method. So this is all that convention where Microsoft makes it easy once you know their little secrets. Not even secrets, they're conventions, once you recognize their conventions. So you might type in a URL, http:/:myapp:/port 5000/books/Moby Dick. And what that will do is get you the books controller and the Moby Dick method, which is nonsense. It would have been something else. But you see that that URL is going to contain the name of the controller class and the action method within the class. Okay. As you're learning this stuff, as you're working with the sample applications, the controller action methods are a great place to put your debug code. Your learning code, those are awesome places to get started because you'll see what's happening there. The controller, if it needs data, will probably go out to the model. That's why I say controller model view instead of model view controller. The controller will probably make the model to handle the data, and then it will hand off to the view that prepares the response that goes back to either the browser if it's a web application or the client if it's a REST application. Here's the model. They're dirt simple. All they are is just a plain data carrying class. Here we have an artist class with a couple of attributes. That's it. That's all there is to writing a model. Here's a view, and if you're brand new to .NET Core, this might be a little bit intimidating to look at. This is the worst part of the whole thing, but it's not that bad once you know what it's all about. It uses a language called Razor. Razor is Microsoft's template for plugging together data with HTML and maybe CSS. So looking at this thing, what we see is at model. The at sign is Razor's way of saying, hey, I'm about to use some C#. So at model, manage logins view model says, I'm going to be working with one piece of data. Views work with one piece of data, not many. And my piece of data is the class manage logins view model. Now, that view model is kind of a funny thing. What that is, they realize, hey, I'm not going to have one model that has all the data I need for one of my pages, one of my views. So what do? You combine two of them, but you make a new class for that thing. You kind of aggregate things into one and call it a view model. So that's kind of a way to cheat off that one piece of data deal. But we're saying I'm going to use the class manage logins view model. Here we see a little bit more Razor where we define a thing called view bag title. We see some HTML, the H2 heading, with that string view bag title. And then we have a paragraph, and interestingly enough, on the next line, model.currentlogins.count. That is using that chunk of data that we passed in at the front. That's all there is to it. So that's how you read Razor. You look at the at signs, that's C# about to start. You know that you're going to use one chunk of data of some kind. It's going to be one of your model classes. Or if you really want to use data from more than one model, a view model. That's it. Nothing scary once you know all those things. To compile and run, when you do a .NET restore, that's how you tell NuGet, hey, go get all my packages. Bring down all the libraries that I told you to put in that Project.json file. .NET Run compiles the application to a bytecode format, and that's where the OBJ and bin directories come into play. .NET Run also executes the program. You don't have to do that if you want to. If you've got your program built already, and there's different ways to use this tooling. I'm just giving you the simple ways to do it. You can say .NET and then the path to your program's DLL. It'll run it without going through the compilation step if you want. Then build your own. So we talked about getting the source, getting the framework that's easy with those handful of commands. We talked about how you can study things so you can learn to write a basic application, then a little more complicated one, then an almost real one. And finally, ways to build your own. There's a lot of ways to go about it. .NET New is the first one. That gives you that hello world, but you also should know there are flags you can give to .NET New to write different flavors. If you want to write a web application, you can provide a flag that will provide a little more useful application than the hello world. You can mutate a sample. I'm sure we'll all do that right away once we get the samples. Change them a little bit. You can build things from scratch in a text editor. You can use Visual Studio, the traditional version that comes with Microsoft Windows. A lot of folks use Microsoft Windows for desktops, corporate standards. That's fine. You can use Visual Studio for it, and that's really kind of the Cadillac of the development IDEs, right, for Microsoft. So that'll work very well. Yeoman is another generator. So you might have used this before with Node.js or something else. Yeoman is a way that you can specify what kind of application you want, and it will make one for you. And VS Code, which we saw an example of this morning a couple different times, is kind of like Sublime Text, and it'll provide you IntelliSense and debugging and all those nice things too. By the way, if you're a Fedora user, there might be some frustrations with VS Code. If you're a RHEL user or a Windows user, it's a lot more straightforward. I think it can be done with Fedora, but expect a little bit of a battle there. Okay, let's review the low-level stuff just to see what we've talked about. Get the software as yum install, enable it with SCL enable, write your first application, do that .NET New, .NET Restore, .NET Run to write a better application, study the music store, and learn to get a handle on that controller view model stuff. Where do we go from here? So once you've done these simple examples, and again, to install and get started is just a matter of minutes, a few short minutes. After a few days, probably through those examples, then you'll be wondering, how do you get even more productive after that? Developers.redhat.com is probably your best source. So go out there, sign up today, get your free version of RHEL. We give away all kinds of good stuff there. We have forums to answer questions. That's a good resource to use for all kinds of RHEL and .NET things. Channel 9, those videos are good. Look at GitHub. Microsoft is doing all this out in the open. They're doing it the open source way. You can look at the source code, you can pull it down, you can do a pull request if you want. Lots of good things, and lots of blogging going on. So there's a lot of things to learn, a lot of ways to learn about this stuff. Here's developers.redhat.com, an example. This one's from our own Don Schenk at Red Hat, and he's telling how to get Music Store to run on RHEL. So there's that. review what we just talked about. We talked about why you should care. .NET Core has the potential to be big. You can learn a lot of great things, and it's not hard to get started. We talked about the major pieces you get with yum install, NuGet and what it does. We talked about ASP.NET and the entity framework. We talked about how. We talked about .NET New, .NET Restore, .NET Run. We talked about the 3 examples. We talked about the music store. And we talked about MVC and the good things that come with it. We talked about where to go from here with developers.redhat.com, Channel 9, blogs, and the doc. Okay, so let me run through quick the treat that I promised at the end. Something completely different. This is going to be 6 things that I learned at work. And probably some of these things are obvious to some of you, maybe not to all of you. I hope not. I hope it is something to be shared. And you probably have similar things that you've learned along the way. The first one is all programming work is the same. And I never realized this. When I was a new programmer, I was working one day. I was trying to get a bump to the next level. I was a beginning programmer. I was working hard to get a promotion to level 2. And I was sitting there one afternoon slaving away, and a friend of mine came by who was a senior level programmer. And he said, "Rick, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm trying to do this work. I think if I get this done, I can probably make a case for getting a bump to the next level up. I think this is that level work." And he laughed in my face. And he said, "Rick, don't you realize all programming work is the same?" He said, "If I came down and sat down and tried to solve this problem, I'd struggle with it a little while too. Maybe as long as you, maybe not because I'm more experienced. If you picked up some of my workload, you'd solve some of it as fast as I do. Maybe some faster, most probably a lot longer because you're not as experienced. But there is not a hard level in between what a beginning programmer does and what a senior programmer does. It's all the same. It's just a matter of experience." Once I had that thought in my head, I approached my career a little bit differently in seeking promotions, and it worked a lot better. The second one is programming is 99% boredom, followed by 1% sheer horror. And especially when you're close to the operations side of things, when you're close to where programs move, and when they're customer-facing programs, you realize that there are just some things that can be terrifying. When you move something and you realize that you're showing the wrong bank balance, or you're showing some product you don't have, something like that, you'll know that it's a lot of boredom, but there are places that are dangerous, and you have to be aware of where those places are and be careful and treat them with respect. The next one I learned working on a golf course, not as a programmer. This is where a friend of mine, I came into the shop one day dejected because I'd broken a piece of equipment. I'd been working and I broke something. And he said, "Rick, why do you look sad?" I said, "Well, I was out on the mower and I hit something and I broke it. And I thought I was going to be chewed out or maybe fired or something." And what my foreman said was, "You know what? It's impossible to do work without breaking something. If you're not breaking something, that's a sign that you're not really doing any work. So don't be afraid to break something once in a while. Stretch a little bit and don't try to break something, but if you do break something, just realize that's just inevitable. Everybody makes mistakes." And talking about mistakes, something to know is there are no small mistakes with dump trucks or chainsaws. This I also learned working on the golf course. We work with chainsaws, and when you drop a tree, you can't be exact in how you fell it. As you get experienced, you can be pretty close. You can mostly decide where that tree is going to fall. But sometimes you have a tree that decides it's going to fall somewhere else, and that just happens. Same thing with dump trucks. When you're working a dump truck and you drop a load of something, you can't exactly control where that load goes. It's not going to be a neat pile. These tools are inexact. If you mostly get the job done, you're going to be okay. You won't be criticized. But if you do make a mistake, it's going to be a very big one if you're working with a dump truck or a chainsaw. There are areas like this in programming. In programming, mostly it's architectural. And I realized this when I was studying for the Sun certification for an enterprise architect. One thing they taught us was when you make a major decision in architecture, prepare a defense for it. So prepare a defense and say, when I made this decision to use this framework, to design these classes this way, to use this particular tool, these are the things I was thinking. I thought, here are some alternatives. Here is why I chose the one I did. And if you do that, if you happen to have an error, you'll at least have a defense for it. Otherwise, in something like architecture, mostly it's all good. When there is something wrong with architecture, it's one of these kind of mistakes. It's going to be a big one. So have your defense ready at those junctures. The final 2 points I have are for those of us in the audience that are the younger programmers and are thinking about going into management? Because we have this loss, right? We have programmers that disappear after the age of 30. Where do we go? Sometimes we go into management or other career paths. Why is that? This tip I learned from one of the fellows that had one of the white cards. He was about 60 years old when I was in my 20s, and we were working on a problem together, and he said, you know, Rick, when I was a programming manager, we did it this way, and my mind just froze, because I thought, you know, I want to get into management. That's what I want to do. I want to be a programmer till I'm good enough, and then I'll get into management, and there'll be more money, and I'll be bossing people around instead of doing the work, and that's where I want to go. That's what I thought. That was my career path. And my friend, who I respected, said he used to be a programming manager, but now he was a programmer. So I thought, how can this be? And I said, Henry, how can that be? How were you a programming manager, and now you're a programmer again? And he said, Rick, I didn't like it. And the reason I didn't like it was because they nip at you from the top, and they nip at you from the bottom. And what he meant was, when you're a programmer, you receive direction usually from one place, a boss that tells you, or a couple of bosses that tell you, here's what you are to produce. And if you're competent and do a good job and just put forth a good effort, you usually won't be criticized very much. But if you're a manager, you have two stakeholders that want something from you. You have your superiors, and what they want is efficiency. They want you to produce things for them at the lowest cost and with the fewest people. And below you, you have your friends, the programmers from which you've risen, that want to work a decent work week and want to have training and want to have a good work environment. These two are in conflict. So you have nipping at the top and nipping at the bottom, and you have to deal with that. So just be aware, this is one of the things you have to put up with. And the final tip I have to say, again for the younger programmers, if you did not know, oftentimes a good senior programmer is paid more than the manager that's managing them. You may not have known that. I didn't know that. When I realized that, that changed my thought about my career path. I decided, you know what? I like this programming gig after all, and I've been here ever since. That's all we've got. You've been a great audience. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of the show.